Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a writing coach, a manuscript editor, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with Burt Solomon. Burt is an editor contributing editor at The Atlantic, and he's the author of some very engaging historical fiction novels set in the in the Civil War era. So we're going to talk about those, and we'll talk about journalism and all kinds of stuff. So Burt, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk first about the most recent novel that's out there, The Murder of Andrew Johnson. Now, history does not say that Johnson was murdered, but you make a fairly convincing case for the possibility that he was. So let me bring the book cover in there, and tell us a little bit about this book.
He probably should have been murdered. Um, he, he was the first president to be impeached and the first president to be acquitted. And so he comes up in, I mean, he's a fairly obscure character in American history, except when impeachment comes up, which is almost routine these days.
Right.
To the House Republicans for that. Lately, anyway. So I've turned he died 8 years after leaving the White House in disgrace, and he died at his daughter's house in East Tennessee. What the doctor said was apoplexy, which is then the parlance for what we call strokes. And I've turned that into a murder. And found many, many suspects who would be happy to see him gone, both from what he did in his presidency, which was really fairly unpopular, in his handling and Reconstruction and other aspects of his presidency, and some other things that I found which were really quite interesting, such as some letters of extortion that he actually had in his possession, according to a magazine article written some decades later. And there was some belief that he was either involved in or at least had foreknowledge of John Wilkes Booth's plot to assassinate Lincoln, which made Andrew Johnson, who was then the vice president of the United States. For better or worse, mostly for worse. So I've taken that era, taken that time in 1875 when this takes place, and kept all of the main characters the same, and kept the events the same, and tried to kind of burrow in to what might have happened if he in fact had been murdered. And I think it's a reasonable case that he might have been murdered.
I want to read just a short excerpt from the book where you have two people talking and they're discussing Johnson, and let's see. I'll just pick it up here where one person is saying, once President Johnson made an enemy, you became his enemy for life. He collected enemies. It was a point of honor with him to never make up. A matter of his manhood. If he had so many enemies, how did he keep rising all the way to the executive mansion, for God's sake? What was his political secret? I've puzzled over that for years, and I think the answer is this. It was because the people, loved him for the enemies he made. His enemies became their enemies. He was smarter than they were and shrewder and unrelenting, truly unrelenting, which counts for a lot in politics. But above all, he was one of them, and that never changed, and his supporters knew it. They would follow him to the depths of hell, even after he started to do the slavocracy's bidding, having attacked them all his life. Was this intentionally made to sound like Trump?
Yes and no. He really was like Trump, intentionally or otherwise. He just was in many ways. But I was certainly knowledgeable. I had this in my mind when I was writing it, and it was certainly the reason that my editor wanted me to write about him as opposed to random other people. who I might have made murdered, who died peacefully in their beds. Um, he was he was startlingly like Trump. Um, he was a vindictive man. He was thin-skinned. Um, he was self-obsessed. He was deeply ambitious. He was deeply insecure. He was boastful. He was suspicious. He was unforgiving. He was humorless. He did, in fact, glory in his enemies, and he loved his enemies. Not like Jesus loved his enemies, but like he loved having them, as you were just reading about. He even had one of his private secretaries wrote years later. He even had small hands and feet. uh, and so he was different from Trump in certain ways. He was a man of great courage, physical and political, and he was absolutely honest. I mean, apparently he would not take a penny from anybody. Though there were rumors that he was acquitted at his impeachment trial because of money that changed hands, so that has never been proved. Um, but he was unwilling to compromise, and he considered it, that's what a man does. I mean, he stands up. But he really did come from a populist background. I mean, he was born in a log cabin, and his parents were illiterate. And he taught himself to read, or he was taught as either a teenager or as an adult. It's not entirely clear. Um, and so he really did come from East Tennessee, is where he was raised, and from kind of the Appalachian sections in East Tennessee in the mountains. And so he really did come from the people that the former president, our former president now, Trump, does represent. But I mean, Trump grew up, wealthy, and had $1 million from his dad.
Mhm.
Johnson really did grow up as a man of the people.
Why do you suppose that Lincoln chose him to be his vice president if he had the character that you describe?
Well, he was a man of courage, and he was the only Southern senator who remained in the Senate after the South had seceded. So he was pro-union. He was also, interestingly, a Democrat. Lincoln famously was a Republican.
Right.
And Lincoln's reelection chances in the spring and summer of 1864 looked pretty bleak because the war was not going well. And the man who was vice president, who was named Hannibal Hamlin, a Republican from Maine, added essentially nothing to the strength of the ticket. Maine is unpopulated, and another Republican. Whereas adding a Democrat to the ticket and making a kind of a national unity ticket would pick up Democratic votes, both in a couple of southern states were back in the Union, but mainly in northern cities. There are a lot of Democrats in New York City and in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and Lincoln needed those votes. By the time the election came around, Lincoln was in much better shape because Sherman had gone through Georgia and ravaged Georgia, and the war was going much better. And so he actually won re-election without too much difficulty, but it was not at all clear when Johnson was chosen by the convention.
Now, the protagonist in your novels is John Haye, and he was one of Lincoln's secretaries. And all three of your historical fiction novels feature Haye as the protagonist. Talk a little bit about Haye. He's a fascinating character, and I don't think a lot of people know much about him.
I really took a great liking to him early on, and right away when I thought about writing the Lincoln book, I thought about John Haye as the detective, though I didn't even know I knew much about him. He had an astonishingly interesting career. He grew up on the western edge of Illinois in what was then the frontier in a small town, and his dad was a small town doctor. He came into the Lincoln orbit because his uncle was a lawyer on the same floor in the same building as Lincoln worked in Springfield, the Illinois capital. And so he became assistant private secretary to Lincoln, helped out in the campaign, and then went to the White House with Lincoln. And he was only 23 years old and became rather like a son to Lincoln. And was a really funny guy. He was a great wit. And Lincoln, of course, in the saddest, White House, Lincoln had a wonderful sense of humor and loved having Haye around. After he left the White House, after Lincoln was killed, and he was actually by Lincoln's bedside after Lincoln was shot and was taken across the street from Ford's Theater. He then became a diplomat and served in 3 different embassies, U.S. embassies in Europe, and then became a journalist and worked for the New York Tribune, which was Horace Greeley's, what he called a great moral organ, a very pro-abolitionist and kind of left-wing rag, but a very good newspaper in New York. Then he moved to Cleveland, which is where he just moved when this Andrew Johnson book starts, and to work for his father-in-law and to co-author a 10-volume biography of Lincoln. He became a poet and a novelist, and then ended up, partly because of campaign contributions to McKinley, became ambassador to the court of St. James in London, in Britain, and then became McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt's Secretary of State, and quite a distinguished one. He was very clever and delicate about how he worked things. He worked out, Japan and kind of, and China, and working out, the opening of Japan, and helping with the war going on in China, and had a really amazing career, and was a very cool guy, actually. I mean, I really just quite liked him.
Well, and you capture his sense of humor and all of those things. One of the very last line in your book, in your afterword, you say that my goal is for readers to feel like they're there, and I have to tell you, you really do. And I want to read just a couple of examples that really just jumped off the page to me and took me back to the 1870s. Haye writes, I caught the noon train south toward Columbus. No trouble with the reservations, not when your father-in-law is a director of the railroad of 4 or 5 others. I had a compartment to myself. It was paneled in mahogany, curtained in silk, upholstered in velvet, trimmed in ebony and gold, carpeted in a tapestry caressing my feet, a testament to what my pal Clemens has dubbed the Gilded Age. But what, pray tell, was wrong with Gilded? And is Clemens Mark Twain?
Yes, that's right. Twain, they're pals. And I mean, what I like about Gilded is that when you think about it, you scrape off Gilded and it's not Gilded anymore. And this book takes place in the U.S. was basically in an economic depression from the Panic of 1873. And so, though, I mean, I've been watching this TV series, on HBO called The Gilded Age, and it's in New York and all the mansions and everybody is rich, as was where Haye was living in Cleveland after he moved from New York to be with his father-in-law. But a few blocks away, it wasn't gilded at all. Women were selling soap on the street, and there was a tremendous amount of poverty at the same time.
Well, here's another little nugget that jumped out. A woman was standing in the doorway, clad in a plain black gown with more buttons up the front than there are hairs in a mare's mane.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you get these?
All sorts of places. I get things like that. I mean, I would find fashion, stories in old newspapers and in old magazines. And there would be lovely pictures, in Harper's or in Leslie's Weekly Illustrated, that would show the gowns that women were wearing. Or there would be stories in the New York Times or other newspapers. I spent a lot of time trying to get the local feel of. I mean, 2/3 of the book takes place in Washington, D.C. The first third takes place in Tennessee. And there were a bunch of Washington newspapers at the time. And I found one in particular. The Evening Star was the famous one, and a very good paper that lasted until I think the 1980s. But there was a newspaper called the Washington Chronicle, which was only around for a few years. And they would have a great column on the back page every day of just local happenings, of something going up in flames on the corner of 14th Street and F, right? And a collision between two carriages, and a kid was thrown half a block down, and just all sorts of kind of nitty gritty things about what it felt like to live there at the time.
Did you read these papers at the Library of Congress?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. The Library of Congress, I'm a huge fan of, and to me, it's a national treasure. And they would have these newspapers there.
I would imagine that research is your sweet spot. I mean, you must just love to immerse yourself and lose yourself in research. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great fun. And the first time I did this, the first book I wrote was nonfiction, and it was about baseball in the 1890s in Baltimore and Brooklyn, where they ain't. And I found an old, wonderful, colorful newspaper, a Baltimore newspaper that no longer exists. It was destroyed in the 1904 fire, and it never got back again. But it was written for working man's paper, and it was just beautifully written. And I went through 8 years of that paper, every page, every day.
Wow.
I would go to College Park, Maryland, University of Maryland campus, where they had that paper. That was one that was not at the Library of Congress. And I would spend all day there, and I would like be going to an alternative universe, right?
And I want to go to the Orioles in a little bit, but let's go back to the John Haye novel. There's another example of your writing that's descriptive and vivid. As a destination, I wouldn't recommend Carter's Depot at sunrise. Not that I would recommend any place at sunrise, but the railroad station was especially distressing. Voices ricocheted like the squeals of bats in a cave, and the benches still served the occasional patron as a tenement house. The floor, by its looks, hadn't been swept for a month. When you're doing your research, though, you're just immersing yourself in this. So help me understand the connection between research and the writing, because as a researcher, you can get down a rabbit hole and stay there forever. So the question then is, how difficult is it to take those little nuggets and drop them into the narrative of your novel?
Well, I'm careful not to go down rabbit holes too deeply, and I learned this as a journalist, because you just don't have time to do that. And so I have a sort of good instinct about when I have enough and when to stop. And I would also, but then I'll think, oh, I don't know it well enough, and I might go back to it. And I'll have a computer file with all of these little nuggets in there. And then when I got to a point in the writing when I was, he was walking down the street and I wanted something to happen to make you feel that you were there, I could go to that file of nuggets, and they're based on real stuff. All of these little tiny events. I mean, my favorite one in here is about the sheep entering the jewelry store on Pennsylvania Avenue. That really happened. Right? And so I found it on the back page of that newspaper I was mentioning before. And so I would then put that in. I mean, you can't do it too much. You have to you have to calibrate it a bit.
Exactly. And so do your files reflect, topics, like a street scene in Washington, or, in other words, so that you are researching different elements that you're going to need, so that you've filed them in a place where you can easily pluck them when needed?
Yes. I mean, I have a file in DC, a long file, and it would have incidents, and I have just sort of minor little incidents like we were talking about, so I could just sort of pick from. And then there'll be on Pennsylvania Avenue, and what it was like to walk down the street, what it looked like. And there are old maps that you can find, and old city directories. And the ads in old city directories are marvelous, right? And so
Right.
you go and you find about a blacksmith on such and such a street. And so
Okay.
my character walking from one place to another, I look at a map, an old map, and find out what was there. And some of the best old maps have named the stores that were there. And this is a wood and coal shop, um,
Right.
yard, I guess is the right term,
Yeah.
apothecary. And so when John Haye is walking down the street through Washington, the things that he's walking past are real.
Yeah, I mean, and it definitely feels that way. Let's talk about the first book that you wrote that was fiction, and tell us about the murder of Willie Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln's 11-year-old son Willie was not murdered, or was he?
Um, Historians would say no, is all I would say. Um, I'm agnostic about it. I was actually I'd written 3 nonfiction books, and I'm basically a nonfiction guy. And I was staring at my screen one morning, writing a book about the Supreme Court in 1937, and the proposal to pack the court. I'm kind of staring off into space, actually sitting right where I'm sitting now. And I'm thinking, a murder mystery in the Lincoln White House.
Mhm.
Wouldn't that be fun? I love murder mysteries. I love Lincoln. Wouldn't that be fun? And my next thought was, as I mentioned before, John Haye is the detective. That's a really nice idea too. So I started to read about Lincoln, and was then reading biographies of him, and read about the death of his son, in his favorite, lovely son, 11-year-old. He died in 1862 of what the doctor said was typhoid fever. I said, how about if I turn that real event into a murder?
Hmm.
So I went to the National Institutes of Health, which has a National Library of Medicine, which has a history section, which is marvelous. And there's a guy there who sort of runs the place, lovely man. And I said, okay, I have this problem. I want to turn a typhoid fever death into a murder. What do you suggest? and, and he suggested a particular poison that would work, that would replicate all of the symptoms of typhoid fever except one. And I used that difference, in the symptoms as a major plot point. Because
Mhm.
I find that difference, it becomes not typhoid fever, but something much more nefarious. And I found in the history section at the National Library of Medicine things like how they did an autopsy, written by the man in France who had taught the doctor who performed Willie Lincoln's autopsy. And this
Wow.
actual step by step of what he would have done. And so when I'm writing about Willie Lincoln's autopsy, and John Haye comes in and basically faints, but I'm getting all the details right about what he did with the scalpel, and then what he did with the blood, and then what he did, and so forth. And so in each of these instances, and you mentioned before the railroad station in Elizabethton, Tennessee, it still exists.
Hmm.
You can't get in, but you can stare through the windows, right? And there's a couple of scenes in the murder of Willie Lincoln that takes place in what they call the old soldiers' home, where Lincoln used to spend summers. That's still open as a museum. And so I would go there a couple of times, and they would let me go through the basement, because that's where John Haye was going. So it's off. You're not allowed in there generally, but the curators were always very nice about such things. So I got to go, exactly where my characters would be going. And it's so much easier, I find, to bring a place alive when you can actually be there and sit inside it. And on the Lincoln book, and actually the Teddy Roosevelt book even more, I would go downtown I live outside of Washington, D.C., and I would go downtown to like Pennsylvania Avenue and sit in Lafayette Park across from the White House when at midnight and sort of block out in my mind the traffic lights and the cars, and everything else is the same as it was. Right? The White House was there. The statue of Andrew Jackson on horseback is there. The trees are probably some of them are the same. The view is all the same. The feeling is the same, and it's so much easier. You can sort of immerse yourself physically. And then it makes it so much easier to write about it. I would then go home and sit in my front of my computer as I am now, and close my eyes and kind of try to imagine being there.
And let's talk briefly about the Teddy Roosevelt book, The Attempted Murder. Again, this sort of is a flash forward where John Haye is in his 60s, I guess, and there's a trolley accident that actually happened that Roosevelt was involved with. It was considered an accident, but you're turning it into an assassination attempt. What's that story?
Well, there really was this accident. I mean, I was trying to find my editor said, let's do something about Theodore Roosevelt. He's really like, people like him. And so I said, yeah, that sounds good. And so I started to read, biographies of Roosevelt and looking for an incident or a death that I could work with. And in 1902, about a year after he became president, he was doing a campaign tour of New England. And he was going from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in far western Massachusetts, near the New York border, to Lenox, Massachusetts, and was coming downhill in his carriage with the governor of Massachusetts and his Secret Service man, Roosevelt's Secret Service man, and was hit broadside by an electric trolley that was going down the hill. And Roosevelt was thrown 15 or 20 feet, and his leg was injured in a way that actually years later, when he died, I think 17 years later, that was considered one of the sort of contributing factors, the injury to his leg. His serviceman was killed instantly. He was thrown under the wheels of the trolley and sliced up. He died. And the governor of Massachusetts escaped without injury. And so I said, that's an interesting episode. And the driver of the trolley was actually indicted and found guilty, but given basically a slap on the wrist. But I have made him into a character, and why would somebody have put him up to try to kill the president? And again, Roosevelt, like Johnson, and certainly like Lincoln, had plenty of enemies. And so it was quite plausible for his enemies to try to do something to him, as his predecessor had just happened, right? He became president a year earlier because his predecessor had been murdered in Buffalo, New York.
That's right.
And so it was totally plausible that he also would be murdered.
I want to talk about journalism a little bit, and you have, because Haye, as you mentioned, was a journalist for a while. There are a few little tidbits that you have in the Andrew Johnson book that give us some insights into journalism. And of course, as a journalist, you write what you know. And I found this interesting. This is just a snippet from an interview that John Haye is doing with someone, and he's not getting anywhere. And so Haye says to the guy, "What else did he say?" "I tried, still hoping for a fact worth the ink." These are just little tidbits. Another one is, let's see. He's doing an interview, and the person says, "If I may be permitted a question, Mr. Haye, why do you ask? Idle curiosity?" And Haye says to himself, "Perceptive man, how much should I tell him? It was a journalist's strategy to press others for tantalizing details while offering the fewest possible in return." Very true. And one final one. In this particular interview, Haye has somebody really talking, and he says, Haye writes to or says to himself, he asks another question, and then he says, I hadn't taken notes yet for fear of slowing the spigot. Because as soon as someone is self-conscious that they're being recorded one way or the other, they'll start to clam up. And that, I'm sure, is, you're basing this on some interviews that you've done in relationships you've had with sources. Am I right?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to be careful when you turn the tape recorder on, right? And when you pull out a notebook, because it changes the nature of what's going on there. And so it's a very kind of subtle, sort of relationship that you're trying to build. And you want them to tell you the truth, but you don't want them to be too self-conscious about telling you the truth.
Right.
You want them to tell you things that they don't necessarily want to tell you if they thought about it better.
Let's talk about journalism. You've been in journalism for pretty much as long as I have. So journalism has changed. Here's my question. Based on your experience and based on the relationships that you have with non-journalists, what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about journalism and what journalists do?
I think the biggest misconception is that there's political bias. I mean, I think there is bias to have really cool stories. And journalists tend to be left of center. That is true, because journalists tend to be people who are contrarian and question things and don't accept, what they're told on first blush. But I think people would go after, Democrats as nastily as they will go. I mean, certainly went against Clinton after Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, as relentlessly, doggedly, nastily, whatever, as they did against Donald Trump in 2016. And so I think the instinct is just to find stuff that people don't want us to know. And so I think I think the biggest misconception is that it's sort of ideological. I think basically it's not.
Okay. And how has journalism evolved? Because uh, are you seeing much more advocacy journalism or more bias among journalists than maybe there was when you first started out?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, there's certainly more polarization, right? And so there's, your journalistic ecosystems, which did not exist before. I had the good fortune really to work for, there's a small magazine called National Journal, but we were read, it was sort of an insidey Washington kind of publication that was read by everybody on both sides. And it was read by a lot of people in the White House, whether it was Republican White House or Democratic White House. It was read by people in Congress and their staffs, no matter what side they were on. I actually started journalism, or my second job was with an alternative weekly lefty paper, where you had to take a position in order for the stories to work. And there are occasional stories, so I had a hard time figuring out what I thought about it. And it made for kind of lousy stories because I didn't have a good, strong position. And I actually felt a lot more comfortable at National Journal, where you had to really be fair and really do talk to both sides and really do try to understand what both sides, where they were coming from, and understand why they thought what they thought. Now that magazine is gone now, right? Because it was also in depth, and there's less appetite now for both depth and for studied neutrality. And so if I watch CNN, which I often do, I can understand why people on the right feel that it is lefty.
Right.
Last night I watched Sean Hannity with a bit of Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis, and his questions were actually pretty straightforward, I thought. But I don't listen to Fox News enough, I suppose. But it's sort of an either or at this point, and it's really tough to find journalistic outlets which really try to be fair and balanced, as Fox pretends it is and generally is not.
Right, right. So, what's your take on the 2024 election? Can you explain why Trump is the front runner for the Republican Party?
Uh, no and yes. I mean, I think are still. I read in a column in 2016, and I can't remember the columnist, that said basically a third of the electorate is always anti everything. It's kind of a like that kind of thing. I'm sort of hesitant to get too vulgar here.
Right.
Of hell with all of you. And so that's always been the case. The Know Nothing Party back in the 1830s, 40s, and so forth. And so there's always been that kind of sentiment. Trump revs that up and can add to it. I mean, my long-term sense of this, and it goes beyond 2024, is that two huge things are happening in this country. One is the economy is changing hugely, tectonically. Same way in the 1870s, actually, when it was moving from pastoral America to industrial America. We're now moving from, kind of manufacturing and into a sort of a digital economy, and demographics are changing hugely, right? And so, by 2046 or whenever, we will supposedly be a majority non-white country. And when those things happen, people feel abandoned and people feel left. There are winners and there are losers. And so people feel abandoned. And I think Andrew Johnson's represented them in the 1870s, 1860s, and 1870s. And I think Donald Trump represents them now. And he both represents them and kind of urges them on. And so he's not just reflective of it. He's, obviously a strong actor for it. And so, so there is a lot of the electorate that this speaks to.
Exactly. Okay. So what are you working on now? What's coming? What's in the pipeline?
Well, I'm trying to decide what book to write next. And there's a thriller set in Jerusalem that I've been wanting to write for 35 or 40 years. And the way I have it framed now, I mean, I love stories, and this Andrew Johnson story is actually reflective of that. One of my the inspirations, I guess, is an old mystery novelist named Ross MacDonald, who I loved, and he would find a mystery in present day, and then it would be intertwined with this mystery from long ago, which in Southern California was like World War II. Right, and the two mysteries would become intertwined, and in order to solve one, he had to solve the other. So this Jerusalem is a perfect place for that. And so the story that I have takes place in 1917. It goes back to New Testament times, and then it goes back eventually to Old Testament times.
Oh my, this is like Michener.
Yeah, or yes, that would be a novel, a thriller mystery. And the other one I've been thinking about is about baseball. And when I was writing my book about baseball, Where They Ain't, and it was about how industrial trusts came to baseball. And there was basically what they call syndicate baseball in the National League, and teams becoming commonly owned. And I always thought of it as you can tell American history through the history of baseball. And I was driving home one day a couple of months ago and thinking, why not do that? And do it era by era and find a really good baseball story that embodies what was happening in the country at that time. And I think there are such, about the color bar, the end of the color bar, immigration, I mean, just all sorts of things that was happening in the rest of the country was also happening in baseball.
Wow. I mean, we could talk for hours. Anything you want to talk about? Well, there's one question I have. Because you're a contributing editor at the Atlantic, and one of the pieces that you were involved with was about JFK, and I guess my question is, was there another gunman on the grassy knoll? I need to know.
Short answer is I don't know. If I were writing about it, there'll be plenty of material. I actually have always kind of believed the Warren Report.
Me too. I did too. But the video, the Zapruder film though, it raises the question because his head goes back into the left, and a gunshot from the right rear wouldn't do that. So, I mean,
I
what do
love
you think?
mysteries. I love mysteries. So
Well,
that's
that's your third one. That's your next one after the other two.
that's been written a lot of times, probably. I don't know if you've written fiction or nonfiction, but there's a lot of material there.
Oh man. Well, I mean, and if you're going to write it, it's definitely in good hands. Let's see. People can contact you through your website, burtsolomon.com, where you also have thumbnails of the books that you've written. This has been fascinating. I wish we had more time, but I'm John DeDakis. You've been one-to-one with me, and I've been one-to-one with Burt Solomon. Burt, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.